March 3rd, 1945. A ranch on the outskirts of Abilene, Texas. The morning haze drifts low over the prairie. Dew sparkles on the barbed fence, and the faint scent of mesquite lingers in the air. The sound of boots crushing dirt breaks the stillness. 20 German prisoners of war trudging under guard toward the ranch mess hall. Their faces are hollow, their uniforms worn thin, their pace weary. Inside the mess hall, the air is warm and heavy with the aroma of bacon grease, butter, and something sweet. Pancakes, soft, golden, stacked higher than any man had seen since before the war. The ranch cook, an older cowboy with sunburned skin and a white apron stained from years of frying, flips another batch onto a sizzling griddle. He hums a tune, slow, easy, out of place in wartime. Karl Weiss, a former Luftwaffe mechanic, stares through the doorway in disbelief. His stomach tightens, but not from hunger. His mind whispers, "This isn't real," he mutters in German. "It's a trick." The others nod. For months they'd been told America starved its prisoners, that captives would be worked to death beneath the Texas sun. But the guards aren't yelling. They're smiling. One, barely older than Karl, says, "Eat up, boys. You've earned breakfast." The cowboy cook sets a plate in front of him. 3 golden pancakes, a square of butter melting slowly, syrup catching the light like amber. Karl doesn't move. His hands shake around the fork. He looks at the food, then at the cook. The man's face is plain, sincere, no pride, no pity. Just one man feeding another. One of the POWs beside him breaks first, whispering, "They don't hate us." Karl's chest tightens. For years, every speech, every poster, every marching song had sworn Americans were savages, machines without souls. But this moment, this quiet breakfast on a Texas morning, feels like the first truth he's seen in years. The cook notices Karl's trembling hands and leans closer. "You look hungry, son." His voice is calm, steady. He nudges the plate forward. Karl tries to speak, but no sound comes. His throat closes, eyes sting, and before he can stop himself, tears roll down his face. Around him, the other prisoners bow their heads. No one eats. No one can. Outside, the wind carries the scent of syrup and dust. Somewhere far away, the war still rages. But here, in this small ranch kitchen, a different kind of victory is unfolding. Quiet, human, and undeniable. Karl finally murmurs, barely audible, "They've beaten us with breakfast." Months before that morning, Karl Weiss had believed he'd rather die than fall into American hands. Every German soldier had heard the same stories, that U.S. camps were death pits, that prisoners were beaten, starved, forced to dig their own graves. The propaganda machine had painted the American as a merciless industrial brute, a man without compassion, a nation without conscience. When Karl's fighter unit was overrun outside Liège in late 1944, surrender wasn't a choice. It was survival. He'd been repairing engines for weeks without rest. When a convoy of American trucks surrounded their position, his commanding officer shot himself rather than be taken. Karl dropped his wrench, raised his hands, and waited for the end he'd been promised. But the Americans didn't shoot. They didn't scream. One soldier offered him a cigarette. Another poured him water from a canteen. A medic cleaned the scrape on his forehead. The first shock of capture wasn't cruelty. It was compassion. That night, Karl sat in the back of a truck filled with German captives. He expected interrogation, maybe torture. Instead, they were driven for hours down quiet roads toward the coast. The guards hummed country tunes softly, talking about baseball instead of blood. When they stopped for food, the prisoners were handed the same rations as the guards. Karl looked at the tin of beans and bread and muttered, "Even the enemy eats like kings." Then came the long voyage across the Atlantic. The guards treated them like men, not beasts. The Americans were firm but not vicious. Some even tried broken German. One cold night, as rain drummed the deck, Karl asked a guard, "Why feed us?" Why treat us kindly? The guard shrugged. Because when the war ends, someone's got to live with what we did. Carl didn't grasp it then, but when he reached Texas, the meaning began to sink in. The first thing that struck him was the scale. The camp wasn't a dungeon. It was a small town. Wooden barracks stood in straight rows, each with beds, blankets, even a canteen that smelled of coffee and soap. Prisoners could write letters home. There was a medical tent, a barber, even a tiny library with donated books. The guards weren't monsters. They were farm boys, factory hands, college kids wearing uniforms just like his. They spoke gently, enforced rules fairly, and kept their word. The biggest surprise came at the first inspection. The camp officer read aloud, "Under the Geneva Convention, you will be compensated for labor. You will receive 3 meals a day. You will not be harmed." Carl stood frozen. Paid, fed, respected. It defied everything he'd believed about war. That night he wrote in his diary, "They told us Americans were beasts. But beasts don't follow rules. Beasts don't give roofs to their enemies. What kind of men are these? And how have we lost to them?" In time, that question haunted him more than any battle. Because the answer, he realized, wasn't about weapons or tactics. It was about something deeper, something his homeland had long forgotten. By 1944, the United States had quietly built the largest prisoner of war network in modern history. More than 425,000 Axis soldiers, German, Italian, and Japanese, were held across the country in over 600 camps. Nearly 50,000 found themselves deep in the heart of Texas. The system was a paradox of war. America, a nation founded on liberty, now held hundreds of thousands of enemies behind barbed wire. Yet what stunned the world wasn't the imprisonment. It was the compassion. The U.S. War Department had decided early to honor the Geneva Convention, not only in spirit, but to the letter. Every prisoner received the same calories as a U.S. GI, the same medical care, and access to worship, reading, and recreation. Each POW earned 80 cents a day in canteen credits for their labor. It was a bold act of conscience in a time when much of the world had abandoned morality. Carl Weiss saw it all firsthand. His new home, Camp Barclay, was vast. Wooden barracks lined up with military precision, each housing 200 men. There was a clinic run by Army medics, a canteen stocked with coffee and soap, and a mess hall that operated like clockwork. American guards manned the towers, but many carried no bitterness. What truly confounded the Germans was the trust. Prisoners worked on nearby farms, harvesting cotton, picking fruit, mending fences, often with little supervision. Some were even driven to ranches alone in Army trucks and left to work alongside locals. At sunset, they climbed back in and rode home to camp. Escapes were rare, and those who tried were quickly caught, not because of armed patrols, but because the nearby towns treated escapees with surprising decency. When Carl learned that fewer than 1% of POWs across America had even attempted escape, he couldn't believe it. "Why run?" One guard laughed. "They eat better here than most folks did during the Depression." Word of this spread to Europe through Red Cross inspections. Reports described American camps as clean, orderly, and shockingly humane. One German official dismissed them as propaganda. Another, more honest, said quietly, "If this is true, then the Americans are more dangerous than we imagined." The logic was simple. While the Axis power stride to break the human spirit through fear, America quietly rebuilt it through order and decency. Carl began to notice small details that gnawed at his old beliefs. Prisoners could check out books from the camp library. Steinbeck, Hemingway, even Goethe. A local priest came every Sunday to hold service in both English and German. The guards sometimes joined in the hymns. There were even soccer matches between P teams, watched by curious townsfolk who brought lemonade for both sides. The contrast with life under the Reich was unbearable. In Germany, a worker could be beaten for missing a quota. In Texas, a prisoner was thanked for fixing a tractor. One evening, as the sun burned red behind the barbed wire, Carl wrote in his notebook, "They do not need to crush us. They only need to treat us as men. And that is enough to make us ashamed." Across America, that quiet revolution repeated itself thousands of times, in Louisiana, in Nebraska, in Arizona. Camps operated not as cages, but as lessons in humanity. By the end of the war, even neutral observers admitted the United States had turned mercy into a weapon more effective than any bomb. For Carl and men like him, the war's true battlefield was shifting. From Europe's Iskies to the kitchens and fields of Texas, Carl had grown up with a clear picture of America. Loud, crude, dangerous. The movies shown in pre-war Germany painted it as a land of chaos. Gangsters with Tommy guns, cowboys shooting each other in the dust. A place where money mattered more than honor. But Texas didn't fit any of that. The first time Carl saw a real cowboy, he thought he was looking at a caricature. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat, boots caked with red dust, and a smile that seemed to say he wasn't afraid of anything. He rode past the P-truck on horseback, tipping his hat toward the guards. "Morning, boys," he said with an easy draw. Carl didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It wasn't mockery. It was welcome. A week later, Carl and a dozen other PS were assigned to that same cowboy's ranch. The land stretched farther than Carl's eyes could follow. Flat plains broken by fences, windmills and cattle that moved like brown waves across the grass. They were told to mend fences, haul feed, and fix broken plows. No one shouted at them. No one carried a whip. The cowboy gave orders as if he were asking, not commanding. At first, the Germans hesitated. Years of conditioning had taught them that every job was a test, every mistake an offense. But when Carl dropped a wrench into the mud, the cowboy just laughed and said, "He happens to the best of us. Partner." The word hit Carl like a blow. Partner, not prisoner, not laborer, not enemy, partner. That evening, when the work was done, the prisoners were allowed to sit by the corral while the ranch hands lit a fire and brewed coffee in tin pots. The sun was a deep orange smear on the horizon, the air thick with dust and the smell of horses. The cowboys talked and laughed, passing around cups of steaming coffee. One of them, a wiry young man named Luke, tossed a cup to Carl. "You earned it," he said. Carl took it in disbelief. Coffee had been a memory in Germany since 1942. He held it like treasure, inhaled the aroma, and whispered, "Danke." Luke smiled. "Don't mention it." In that moment, Carl realized something strange. The Americans didn't see him as a defeated enemy. They saw him as another man caught in the same storm. Later that night, the PS were loaded back into the truck. The sky was full of stars, more than Carl had ever seen. He leaned against the sideboard and murmured to another prisoner, "They don't hate us." The man beside him shook his head. "That's why they're winning." As days passed, the prisoners began to soften. The camp no longer felt like punishment, but like an odd temporary home. They began learning English words, swapping jokes with guards, and then teaching the cowboys how to fix German tools. Carl couldn't stop thinking about how differently America used its power. Germany ruled through fear. America ruled through decency. He had once believed cruelty was strength. Now he saw that kindness could break a man faster than any bullet. When he wrote in his diary that night, he didn't write about the fences or the work or the guards. He wrote one simple sentence: "The cowboys don't need guns to win." By midsummer, the camp's routine had settled into an odd rhythm. Mornings spent at the ranches, afternoons under the Texas sun, and evenings filled with the clatter of trays in the mess hall. The Americans were punctual, practical, predictable. For the PS, predictability was safety. Until one day, predictability was shattered by laughter. It began with a simple gesture, an invitation. The local cowboys decided to host a cookout for the prisoners. A barbecue, they called it. Smoke, meat, and music. The idea spread through the camp like wildfire. But to the German prisoners, it sounded like a trick. Surely no sane man fed his enemies steak in the middle of a war. When Karl heard, he couldn't help but laugh. The Americans will grill us, not the meat. His barracks mates roared in agreement. They imagined a trap, a mockery disguised as generosity. But when the day came, the only fire was the one under the grill. The prisoners marched to the edge of the ranch, where long wooden tables were laid out under the shade of pecan trees. Piles of meat sizzled over open flame. Thick slabs of beef and pork brushed, with a dark, sweet glaze that filled the air with an intoxicating aroma. Beside the pit, the cowboys worked with cheerful efficiency, turning skewers, pouring water, passing bread. Karl squinted at the scene and muttered, "This is madness." One cowboy overhearing grinned, "You'll get used to Texas madness, friend." The prisoners were told to sit. Metal plates clattered, knives and forks handed out like a ceremony. No guards pointed rifles, no orders barked. Just the smell of smoke, the hum of conversation, the creak of old country songs playing from a radio in the distance. At first, no one ate. Karl stared at the food, his hands frozen. The meat glistened with juice. It smelled too rich, too alive. It didn't belong in war. One of the cowboys noticed his hesitation and said, "That's just food, son. Ain't no tricks here." Karl took a tentative bite. The taste was overwhelming. Salt, fat, flame, freedom. He dropped his fork and covered his face. He didn't realize tears were running down his cheeks until the cowboy quietly refilled his cup. Around him, other PS began eating. Some laughed nervously. Others bowed their heads in silence. A few simply broke down. The smell of barbecue mixed with the sound of quiet weeping. The cowboys didn't laugh. They didn't ask questions. They just kept serving. When it was over, one of the Americans stood and said, "You boys worked hard all season. The least we could do is feed you proper." Karl tried to respond, but now words came. He understood that the gesture wasn't just food. It was forgiveness, unspoken and undeserved. That night, back in the barracks, the laughter that had filled their jokes about the Americans was gone. One prisoner whispered, "They treat us better than we treated our own people." Karl said nothing. He simply wrote in his journal, "Today we mocked them, and they fed us instead. I think this is how empires fall, not to armies, but to men who refuse to hate." He closed the notebook and lay back on his cot, staring through the slats of the ceiling, listening to the night wind. For the first time, he understood that he was living through something larger than defeat. He was living through revelation. That night, Karl couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that plate of food, the thick cut of meat, the glistening fat, the cowboy's smile. It was ridiculous. How could a meal undo years of training, propaganda, and loyalty to the fatherland? And yet it had. Back in Germany, civilians were starving. His wife Anna had written months earlier that bread was rationed to ounces and children went to bed hungry. Soldiers returning from the front described entire cities burned to ash, factories gone, families gone, hope gone. And here, in the middle of an enemy land, he had been served enough food for 3 men. The math didn't make sense. America wasn't just winning with tanks and planes. It was winning with abundance. The U.S. government had spent more than $1.8 billion housing Axis prisoners. That was more than Germany spent feeding its own army. Every dollar represented a philosophy that dignity was not a luxury, even for the defeated. Karl thought about the men who had laughed at the barbecue invitation. They had expected humiliation and instead received hospitality. They had mocked their captors and were met with compassion. How did one process that? By morning, the camp had changed. Conversations were quieter, eyes softer. The old arrogance, the belief that Germany was the pinnacle of civilization, was collapsing under the weight of decency. At breakfast, Carl watched one of the guards carefully hand out trays. Each man got the same portion as the soldiers. Eggs, bread, coffee, no leftovers, no scraps. The simple fairness of it struck him harder than any speech could. He asked the guard, "Why do you do this?" "We are your prisoners," the guard shrugged. "Because that's what makes us different." Carl didn't understand the full meaning of that until much later. For the Americans, decency wasn't charity, it was identity. It was something built into the foundation of their culture, like the ranch fences that stretched endlessly across the plains. That afternoon he walked past the barbed wire, noticing how it caught the sunlight. It no longer looked like a cage, more like a reminder that freedom meant more than movement. Freedom, he thought, might also mean mercy. When the cowboys came by the next week, bringing leftover food from another barbecue, no one laughed this time. The prisoners lined up silently. Some bowed their heads. Others whispered quiet thank yous in broken English. Carl could feel something shifting deep inside. All the years of pride and propaganda began to dissolve, replaced by strange humility. He wrote again that night. They defeated us without a single insult. Just food. And he meant it. Because the numbers told the story, the industrial might, the wealth, the logistics. But what made the victory complete wasn't material. It was moral. Back in Berlin, Nazi officers preached that compassion was weakness, that mercy belonged to fools. But here in Texas, Carl saw mercy used as a weapon. Silent, relentless, and absolute. He folded his journal shut and placed it under his cot, feeling both broken and cleansed. "They feed us," he whispered to himself, "and I finally understand why we lost." Weeks after the barbecue, the Red Cross arrived with permission slips. German POWs were allowed to write home. Each man was given a single sheet of paper, both sides ruled, and a dull pencil. The letters would be censored, of course, but that didn't matter. For the first time in months, the men had a way to speak beyond the barbed wire. Carl sat on his bunk, staring at the blank page. He didn't know how to begin. Dear Anna felt too small, too fragile. He'd last written her from France when the Reich still promised victory. He had bragged about his uniform, his unit, his loyalty. Now he was sitting in an American camp, fed better than most Germans at home, wearing clean clothes and holding a cup of hot coffee. What did a soldier write in such a moment? He started simply, "Dearest Anna, I am well. You will not believe what this place is like." He described the cowboy men who treated their horses better than German officers treated their troops. He wrote about the barbecue, the laughter, the way Americans seemed to believe that kindness cost nothing. He told her about the food, the music, the absurdity of being served by the enemy. Then he hesitated. Could he write the truth? Could he tell her that the Americans had broken something inside him? Not with violence, but with decency. He decided he must. "They feed us as if we were guests," he wrote. "They do not shout. They do not strike. I begin to think they are not what we were told. They do not strike. I begin to think they are not what we were told." Other prisoners were writing too. Hans, a young artilleryman, scribbled about the ranchers. "The Americans smile at us," he muttered, "as if we were neighbors, not enemies." Weber. The old sergeant wrote to his wife that he had seen a guard give his lunch to a sick prisoner. "If the Führer saw this," he whispered, "he would burn with shame." When the letters were collected, the camp was quiet. For once, no one complained. The men seemed lighter, freer, as if each word on paper had loosened the chains they didn't realize they carried. Weeks later, those letters began arriving in Germany. They passed through censors, through hands that trembled, through families living in ruins. Mothers, wives, and children read them in disbelief. "The Americans treat us better than the Reich ever did," one letter said. "Here we are, men again," read another. The rumors spread quietly at first, whispered in markets, churches, and bombed-out apartments. Then, faster. People began to ask questions if America treated its prisoners like humans. What did that make of the Germany they lived in? For the first time, the lies of their regime began to crack. Not from bombs, but from words. The words of their own sons. Karl would never know it, but his letter became part of that quiet revolution. His wife read it aloud to neighbors, passing it on, line by line. When the Gestapo came asking, Shep pretended ignorance, but she kept the letter hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. In his next journal entry, Karl wrote only one line: "Truth travels farther than any bomb." He realized that his words had become weapons, not of war, but of remembrance. As he folded his letter into the envelope, he looked at the guard collecting them and said softly, "Tell your people they've already won." The guard didn't understand German, but he smiled anyway. And that, Karl thought, was the perfect answer. 2 weeks passed before Karl saw the cowboy again. The same man who had served the barbecue and changed everything. It was a dry, wind-swept afternoon. The dust rolled in low waves across the camp's edge, and the air smelled faintly of mesquite and sun-baked earth. Karl was repairing a fence post when he noticed the familiar figure approaching on horseback. The man rode slow, easy, as if he had all the time in the world. He wore the same wide-brimmed hat, the same weathered boots, the same quiet confidence, but this time he carried something in his hand, a small glass jar. As he dismounted, Karl realized it was a jar of preserves, homemade, a strange, almost absurd gift for a prisoner of war. The cowboy handed it to him without ceremony. "My wife made this. Figured y'all could use something sweet after all that salt pork." Karl didn't know what to say. He took the jar carefully as if it were made of gold. "Why?" he asked in halting English. The cowboy shrugged. "Because war is nearly over. You boys just hang in there." It was the same tone a man might use to comfort a neighbor after a long drought. No anger, no pride, just humanity. For a moment, Karl wanted to say something, anything, to explain how much that gesture meant, but the words wouldn't come, so he did the only thing he could. He held out his hand. The cowboy hesitated for half a second, then grasped it firmly. It was the first time Karl had ever willingly shaken the hand of an American. The touch was brief, rough, and real. Around them, the camp seemed to pause. A few guards watched quietly from the fence line. No one interrupted. The moment didn't need explaining. It was a handshake between enemies who no longer were. When the cowboy left, Karl stood for a long time, staring at the jar of preserves in his hands. It wasn't the food that moved him this time. It was the kindness, the absurd, unshakable decency that had followed him from the barbecue to this moment. That night, he opened the jar with 3 other prisoners. They passed it around, each taking a spoonful of the sweet fruit. No one spoke, no toast, no laughter. Just quiet gratitude. Later, Karl wrote in his journal. He came back. He had nothing to gain and still agave. The next morning, the camp was different again. The men worked harder, smiled more easily. Some of them even tried to mimic the Americans' mannerisms, their laxed posture, the easy smiles, the sense that life was meant to be lived, not endured. When Karl passed by the cowboy's ranch later that week, he saw the man fixing a fence. The cowboy looked up, tipped his hat, and went back to work. Nothing needed to be said. Karl understood then that kindness didn't need an audience. It was strongest when it was quiet. In his next letter home, he wrote, "The cowboy returned. He shook my hand. For that moment, the war was over." He sealed the envelope, unsure if his words would ever make it past the censors. But that didn't matter. He had already been changed. For Karl, the jar of preserves had become more than food. It was proof that even in captivity, a man could still taste freedom if another man had the courage to offer it. By spring 1945, the war was nearly over. The guards no longer carried rifles at all times. The fences still stood, but they felt more like boundaries of routine than barriers of fear. The PS worked, read, played soccer, and waited not for liberation, but for understanding. Karl had changed more than he realized. He spoke English now, joked with the guards, and even helped fix a broken water pump at the camp. He found satisfaction in small tasks, something he had never felt in the Reich's rigid world of rank and punishment. One morning, an officer from the U.S. Army visited the camp. He asked the German prisoners if they would share insights about their training, their logistics, their supply methods. Karl volunteered, surprising himself. He explained in careful English how German units operated, how they communicated, how they failed when the Allied bombers cut supply lines. The officer thanked him and said, "You got a sharp mind, son. Ever thought about staying after the war? You'd make a fine engineer." Karl laughed softly. "Maybe someday. But first, I must go home and tell them what really defeated us. That night, he opened his journal again. The pages were filled with notes, quotes, and quiet confessions. He began his final entry with the words he'd been carrying for months. They called them cowboys. We called them fools, but it turns out the fools were us. He wrote about the barbecue, the jar of preserves, the letters, the handshake. He described how each small act had dismantled years of arrogance, not through punishment, but through proof. The Americans had shown him a different kind of power, one that didn't come from obedience or ideology. It came from trust, from the freedom to be kind without permission. He remembered the guard who told him, "Because that's what makes us different." At the time, he hadn't understood. Now he did. The true power of America wasn't its weapons or factories. It was its faith in the individual, that even an ordinary man given respect and freedom could rise above hate. When Germany finally surrendered, the camp erupted in mixed emotions. Some prisoners wept openly, others stared at the ground, their pride shattered. But Karl felt something else. Relief. The war that had consumed his youth and soul was finally over. Days later, the Americans began releasing PS in small groups. Before he left, Karl found the cowboy one last time. He thanked him not for the food or the kindness, but for the lesson. "You showed me what strength really looks like," he said. The cowboy smiled. "Guess we both learned something." Karl smiled back, his eyes wet. "Yes," he said softly. "Victory doesn't always arrive with a rifle." Years later, when Karl returned to Germany, he became a schoolteacher. He never spoke of battlefield tactics or military heroics. Instead, he taught his students about duty, conscience, and the peril of blind loyalty. During one lesson, he told them, "The Americans didn't defeat us with bullets. They conquered us with kindness and coffee." The class laughed, but Karl didn't smile. He meant every word. The memory of that camp, that cowboy, and that breakfast would stay with him for the rest of his life. Because when history fades, it isn't the weapons or the flags that remain. It's the quiet moments when compassion triumphs over cruelty. And when the soldier became the teacher, Karl understood the greatest truth of all. Mercy doesn't diminish victory. It completes it. As he boarded the train bound for the harbor of return, he turned one last time toward the Texas plains. Endless sky, rippling grass, and the faint silhouette of the camp that had transformed him forever. The sun dipped behind the fence posts, casting the fields in a deep golden hue, as if to remind him that even barbed wire cannot cage light. He thought of that first day. The fear, the pride, the laughter when someone joked about American cowboys, and then the disbelief when those same cowboys handed him a plate of food. Not as conquerors mocking the conquered, but as men extending grace to another human being. They laughed at the cowboy, Karl murmured. He fed them instead. As the train rattled through the night, Karl smiled for the first time in months. He didn't feel like a captive anymore. He felt like a pupil of a nation that had somehow turned war into a lesson about humanity. History would remember the battles, the tanks, the fire, and fury. But Karl knew the real triumph belonged to those who chose decency when cruelty was easier. He closed his eyes as the wheels clattered beneath him and whispered the words that would echo through his life. They defeated us with kindness. As the screen fades to black, the words appear. In a world once consumed by hate, one cowboy's breakfast proved that compassion could win a war.